So I'm delighted to be chairing a session specifically focused on the reality behind the rhetoric of UK net zero ambitions. The UK has historically been a leader in setting ambitions for decarbonisation. I remember back in 2008, I was based in Brussels then. The Climate Change Act was passed, and it really was considered to be this bold and radical move by many other countries in Europe. And there was a lot of jealousy in the sector that we had been able to do this. And if you map UK climate policy since that time, you can see that there has been a sustained commitment, maybe not what everyone wanted all the time, maybe not always ambitious enough, but that political commitment has been broadly stable, including across changes in colour of government. But to what extent might you say ambition is a way of distracting from failure in delivery? Are we leaders in delivery as well as ambition? If you look at the development of the UK offshore wind market, as many other countries do, then you might say yes. If you look at the most recent CCC report, if you look across the whole range of policies and delivery needed to meet our net zero commitments and how we're doing against those, you might say no. For example, domestic retrofit is a perennial and still unsolved problem. Delivery of onshore wind and solar is nowhere near what it could and should be. Ambition is meaningless without delivery, and a policy is only as good as the action that it supports or that it creates. So that's what we'd like to explore in the session. How is ambition translating into policy, and is that policy driving change? Is it giving the people responsible for creating change what they need to do that? If not, what's going wrong and how can it be fixed? So I will invite our panelists to introduce themselves now. We have Mark Potter, who is Chief Technical Officer at 3TI Energy Hubs. We have John Parsons, Digital and Technology Manager at BEAMA, and George Day, who's a Senior Advisor on Net Zero at the Energy Systems Catapult. So can I invite you to introduce yourselves in that order, and then we'll move into the questions.
Sure. Good morning, and thank you. So yes, Mark Potter, Chief Technology Officer at 3TI Energy Hubs. So 3TI has a background in large-scale solar car parks. 3 T's of 3TI, the three technologies are battery, solar, and EV charging. My background prior to this has been in automotive, developing electric vehicles, and prior to that, aerospace.
John Parsons from BEAMA. So BEAMA, we're a trade association representing electrotechnical product manufacturers. I've got 50 years experience in engineering now in the energy industry. Done pretty well everything, to be honest. Lots of work at the edges of the industry, looking how to change it, and still working on
that. Morning, everyone. I'm George Day. I'm a Senior Advisor on Net Zero Policy here at the Energy Systems Catapult. So the Catapult is is a kind of innovation hub. We sit between government, academia, SMEs, and the industry, trying to promote innovation, help new products and new services get into the market. We work with, we're funded by Innovate UK, but we also do work with a range of commercial partners as well. And I guess our strengths lie particularly probably in the sort of building, home, heat, decarbonisation area, but we do work across the energy system. So we're involved in a whole range of activities. My background is I'm the sort of policy and regulation guy, so I was able to join the Catapult a few years back and set up our market policy and regulation practice, because in the energy sector, policy and regulation is a key part of the overall environment for innovation, which is what we're concerned with. So very much looking forward to the discussion this morning.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So to kick off with our first question, how should government and industry be working together to create change? Is it already happening? And if not, why not? I will invite you, Mark, to comment first on that question.
I think you can't look very far without seeing change. So I'd say that change is happening very fast. One of the observations I would make is that we are trying to redirect the path of a probably quite a literal as well as a figurative oil tanker. This is humankind's biggest machine that crosses and traverses not just the energy grid, but the electrical grid, but the gas grid as well. This is an energy system that traverses geopolitical boundaries in a way that humans and goods can't even do. Okay, it's a very big machine, and we're trying to change the direction of it. It's going to take time, and it's a very difficult and tough thing to do. Are we doing it fast enough? We started a bit late. Okay, we knew that this was coming. And one of the biggest challenges I think that we have to face is that the scientific community has made it fairly clear we are now essentially beyond the point of no return. We're going to hit that iceberg, and we have to balance the rate at which we are transitioning the energy system to avoid future icebergs, but we also have to mitigate the impacts of the weather systems that we know are coming as a result. This week itself, has been testament to that. On the same day as my kids are splashing around in the paddling pool outside, there's massive hailstorms over in Malvern, flooding in London, which for me is only about 20 miles away. We have to balance the investment we're putting into the grid with the investment we're putting into mitigating the impact of, our slow sort of direction change here.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. John, would you like to come in on that question? Do you agree with what Mark said there?
Pretty well. I mean, I'm involved with quite a number of committees now where we're working with government, and government is actively trying to work with industry and stakeholders to make this all happen. An observation would be, I think the government doesn't always understand how the supply chain works. It tends to think it can just turn on and off. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done in the coming years, and several years of that will be started just getting things up to speed, getting I know the Labour Party sort of scale back on its ambition for investment, but they made the point that you couldn't spend that money in the first couple of years because the supply chain couldn't absorb it. So there's all of that. There's also, I think, we have a very unusual energy industry structure now, so it's incredibly broken up. It's very hard to manage it, really, to make it do things. There's so many different parties have to be brought together, and you need a deep understanding, I think, of the commercial interests and incentives of all the different parties and how you can sort of try and align them to get the thing to go in the right direction. Or government just gets out and just lets the market rip, basically is the other option. You just sort of let it happen. You just set the incentives in place and let people fight it out. Probably not an efficient way.
I was going to ask, do you have a preference for the former of or the latter of those? But you say it's not.
I'm old enough to remember the CGP. The CGP would have solved this in a year or so. They would have put a committee together and they would have come up. It would not be nearly as imaginative and good, I suspect, as we can end up with, but it would have been a lot quicker. So there's a bit of a balance to be had, I think. The challenge will be, I think, finding the right structures. The government needs to find the bits it needs to control and the bits it can let run, and just sort of allow it just to work and sort of just guide the right bits. Because we are trying to create an incredibly complicated new system. It's a new energy system, and we're also introducing digitalization and all sorts of features, new commercial models, all at the same time. How do you do that, please?
Yes. How do you do that, George? Do you want to come in? Sorry, I'm kidding. But it would be particularly interesting to hear, picking up on the very interesting point John was making there about what government should and shouldn't do from your policy perspective.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think both government and industry need to actually get to grips with quite how big and radical a challenge this is. And I think people both in government and in industry, haven't quite got their heads around just the sheer scale of the challenge, and the fact that everybody is going to have to think big, think radical, and do things in very different ways in future and at different pace. So, as far as the role of government, so I think there's a couple of things that government isn't doing very well at the minute. So it's got lots of ambition. It likes to announce very ambitious targets, but then it doesn't, as I think you pointed out, Helen, in your introduction, the lack of follow through, I think, in terms of concrete policy drivers is the real gap there. So I think government, I'm very much a sort of government sets the framework, sets the outcome, requires, sets up the sort of outcomes it wants to see, and then creates the market framework that incentivizes the market and the investors to go away and deliver that and figure out how best to do that. And so, rather than doing things like announcing targets for specific technologies like, 40 gigawatts of offshore wind or 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028, these very technology specific targets, actually, we don't really care about how much offshore wind or how many heat pumps there are. Actually, we want to decarbonize buildings, and we want to decarbonize the electricity system. So it really should be setting policies that are framed around the outcomes that we want to deliver, and giving very firm market signals around that. So the other aspect, I think, yes, we do need some planning and coordination by government, clearly. I think the big gap there is that local government is underpowered and under-resourced, because the net zero transition is going to need a lot of bottom-up action, a lot of bottom-up coordination. The answers for Aberdeen are going to be different from those in Penzance, and particularly if you're looking at heat and buildings. And so government and local actors need to really be empowered to take the lead, develop local plans, and help to coordinate the investment that goes into local areas. And that's also chimes with a much more decentralized and digitalized energy system, and which is sort of integrated from the bottom up rather than the sort of top down CEGB style approach that maybe we had in past decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. That's very close to my heart, having worked at the local and regional, when that was a thing, level and national and EU level. I think that, reinvigorating and giving the resources to that local level is just so important, and a bit boring, not particularly exciting, or but it absolutely has to be done.
How can you say that? It's really exciting. The local stuff is really exciting.
It is really exciting, but that give them more power, give them more resources.
Absolutely.
I feel like I've not heard that for 20 years, and it's the same thing. And I think these things sort of get lost when you hear them over and over and over and over again, because they're not radical and they're not new and they're not attention grabbing, but they are important. They're absolutely foundationally important.
Yeah, well, that's something very close to the Catapult's heart, and we've worked a lot with developing the concept of local area energy planning,
yes,
and kind of developing some of the tools and the way that you approach doing that. But I think what you need is more power for local government to sort of follow through if they do develop plans, and more resource and more capability, and that also extends into developing the supply chain from the bottom up as well. Because, particularly in heat and buildings, our supply chain is all over the country. It's very decentralized in many respects.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Something you were talking about a moment ago segs us very nicely into the next question, which is, to what extent do you feel that existing targets are effective market signals? I mean, we've kind of started touching on this already. What do you think actually constitutes an effective market signal? And I suspect we will touch on supply chain again in this, which you were just mentioning. So, John, would you like to have a first stab at this one?
Yeah. So I tend to agree with George. I think sort of 600,000 heat pumps a year, it's an ambition, but it doesn't really mean anything to anyone. It doesn't help our members particularly, because what happens if you don't do it? And can they invest against that? So I tend to think government sort of gets focused on trying to find total solutions and sort of solving everything before they start. I think there's an awful lot we should be doing, but we just get on with it and sort of have smaller, lower, lesser ambitious targets to allow people to start attacking the low-hanging fruit and so on. I mean, there's lots of houses you can't do heat pumps in, but there are lots and lots of houses where you can. Let's just get on with them and stop worrying about, we'll find solutions for the other ones. But there's an awful lot that can be done. And then, as you've said, fit in better with the supply chain, which isn't in a position to do everything next year anyway. It's going to have to take a long time to work through all these things. We have enough on the news this morning about smart metering and how long that's taken. We're trying to do sort of smart metering 5 times over or more. So smaller targets with a bit more clarity, I think. So I think the key thing from our members' point of view, I think, is having enough confidence to invest. And that's the thing. And I think the big worry is government says it's going to do something, but then there's a bit of negative press. They tend to walk away from it. So where's the confidence? How can you invest in that?
So do you think there's something about when the scale of the target is too big? It feels like industry can't see the kind of ramp.
It's almost irrelevant. I mean, it's just irrelevant. I think what should they be aiming for? I mean, they should be ramping up. But again, I think what I see too much of, I think, is we sort of got clear, strong ambitions, good targets and so on. But the first net headwind, we sort of walk away from it. And so somehow we're sort of saying net zero is essential. It's an existential crisis. Oh, but it's too expensive.
Right.
So we stop. No, we don't stop. We should then go into another step in that, which what can we afford to do now that's realistically it's going to be effective? Let's get into a sort of a sensible conversation about what we can now properly do and not try and solve it by sort of imaginary solutions for sort of 50 years in the future.
Thank you. George, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in relation to, effective market signals, I think, I very much agree with John. There's the sort of 600,000 heat pumps target. It's not an investable signal. It's an ambition, and I don't think many people believe we're going to meet it. I do worry a bit about net zero electricity by 2035 as well, because kind of what sort of fudge will be involved in the definition of what net zero electricity actually constitutes. I think will be another important kind of room for flexibility or wriggling in that relation. And so the effectiveness of that as an investment driver, as a market shaping signal, I think has to be questioned. So I think we can learn something from the automotive sector. I mean, the clear end date around the sale of internal combustion engines, again, there may be some wriggle room around that, but that clearly has driven a huge amount of attention and investment and shifted the market. I mean, and I think that follows on from, the EU level regulations around, sort of the emissions intensity of car manufacturers, range of products and so on. And those really have driven, millions, probably billions of pounds of investment in R&D in developing EVs, and so the characteristics of those as a market signal is the clarity. I guess they're credible, but also long dated and based around outcomes. So it wasn't a target that we're going to have, 750,000 lithium-ion batteries or some sort of lower level technology specific target. It was very much a sort of outcome based approach, and there was a long lead time as well, which meant that the supply chains and the industries and all the R&D and so on has a credible amount of time to respond to it and to deliver against it. So I think that's that's important, in terms of thinking about how do you create market signals. So if we look in the building sector, we've got things that actually send market signals in completely the wrong direction. So, EPCs are very poorly aligned with net zero and building decarbonisation, but they're incredibly important in shaping the market at the moment. And they're even used for framing policy targets, in terms of buildings reaching a particular EPC rating. So we really need to sort that out in the building sector, get consistent outcome-based targets around the carbon performance of buildings, maybe with a long lead time, and build credible market signals that the supply chain can operate against. I think we're going in the wrong direction at the minute because we've got this new target for sales of heat pumps by boiler manufacturers and so on that's come in, which again I think is probably not a very credible signal and probably not the right one in terms of sending a really credible market signal for building decarbonisation.
Yeah, I think there's broad consensus that the market signals on heat are not
really poor
not
at the moment.
Yet.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, really poor.
Yeah, and so quite often in the wrong direction, which is really nonsensical. Really yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, George. Mark, do you want to comment on that question?
Sure. I think there's a risk of this not being much of a debate. I mean, I completely agree with everything John and George have said here. I think the key for me is that short-termism that we see so often in these targets. That's the killer. Okay, we are trying to move a big ship. Like I said earlier, there has to be long-term view, long-term stability in order for projects, in order for efforts to be investable, or even just the basics. I was thinking back to the yet another failed attempt at insulating the housing stock. And, by the time a policy sort of an incentive is set up, you've now got to get enough qualified, competent, certified people able to do a job. Then you've got to set up supply chains and work the sales funnels through to be able to deliver projects. And by the time those things have happened, those incentives have disappeared. That long-termism is crucial. But I just wanted to pick up on something John said about the kind of government level signals need to be long-term and predictable and stable in order to deliver. But absolutely, there's a need to look local. Okay, when it actually comes to things get delivered because people are motivated to do it, and people are really motivated to do things that are local. Community projects or their own building or their own businesses. And I think it's really crucial to provide enough support to people in those environments. And that's probably one caution over what was said earlier. I absolutely agree that local projects need additional funding, but that funding needs to be spent well. And that means that the people who are spending it need to know how and where to spend it effectively. And that's one of the things which often comes under fire when you look at local council and local public sector funding, is there isn't always the expertise to spend it effectively. And, everything from installing the wrong wrong EV chargers in the wrong place, or installing facilities that just aren't, that take 5 years to get powered up because they haven't secured a connection first or something like that. So, there is a real challenge, a real balance between empowering people to deliver projects they're motivated and really want to get done because it's local and it's focused, versus having a long-term government strategy which incentivizes and enables the market to deliver the right technologies to the right places. I mean, how many times are we going to get this, insulate the housing stock wrong before? How many times have we attempted to get that and failed? Those schemes just don't last long enough.
Yeah. Yes, that is fair. If we want a little bit more disagreement, I can throw in, possibly, I have no idea what your opinions are on this. I'll throw in a question from the chat, which is from Stephen Lamb. Thank you, Stephen. Does nuclear generation have a part to play in our future? And I'll let whoever wants to go first on that one.
I can have a go at that if you like. I mean, so I think the answer is probably yes. We're going to need we're going to need a bit of everything. We do quite a lot of whole energy system modeling at the Catapult. Most of our scenarios include a decent chunk of energy contribution from nuclear. It's obviously really challenging to make that work at the moment. Big nuclear power projects proving really difficult to get built on time, and there's a cost challenge there as well. So again, we've published reports around nuclear cost drivers, how to control the costs of nuclear power projects. We've also looked at the potential for smaller modular reactors. Very Rolls-Royce and people like that are very much in favour of backing those. There does seem to be a real potential role for them to play, to be part of the future energy mix. They're more flexible in terms of siting, potentially because you can manufacture a lot of the components in a sort of factory setting. The cost control is easier, and you can sort of build sort of fleets, if you like, of smaller modular reactors. So there's potential in that, and the government appears to agree with that. And I guess the sort of fundamental reason why nuclear, I think, has a role to play is because we just need so much zero carbon electricity in future. It's going to be the backbone of net zero. We're going to electrify huge swathes of energy demand, which are currently powered by fossil fuels, natural gas or petroleum, whatever. So we're going to need a lot of zero carbon electrons. Nuclear looks to be part of the least cost mix if we can manage the programs right and deliver them effectively.
Thank you, John or Mark. Do you want to disagree?
I hazard an answer, but I'm not sure I've got a BEAMA hat on saying this, but my view is nuclear seems to me to be a poor mix with renewables, because the whole point about renewables is the output's variable and you need to do something to sort of fill in the gaps. Nuclear is not the right technology for that, as it is at the moment. I don't know if some of these smaller modular units could do that better, but you don't want a very expensive form of power generation running your peaking plant. It's just the wrong economic option, I think. You could go completely nuclear and just do the whole thing with nuclear. It'd take a long time and it might be very expensive, but it would be that's a sort of engineering sensible solution. But it's the combination of nuclear with renewables I struggle with a bit, I think.
Yeah, I struggle to see it as anything but what I'd describe at this point as a bridging technology, and that means it's going to be essentially a ludicrously expensive solution, and unfortunately it comes with a very long-term ongoing expense, long beyond the point at which its useful energy output has reduced. I can't deny it has to play a part in our future. Let's be realistic. Hinkley C is still quite a few years away from being commissioned, and there's a lot of money being put into that, and there's no way it can not be used on the grid after a huge amount of energy, of investment has gone into it. So it will be there, but I think the onus is on our industry to bring more and more alternative low carbon sources that don't have such high costs on the upfront and the high post-use costs. You kind of call it recycling costs, but the ongoing storage costs, because that is is crippling and it's going to really hold everything back. So I think the objective has to be to try and make that as small a part of our future as we can. The drive towards smaller distributed energy resources is I think very much the right way to be going at the moment. I would really like to avoid those being distributed smaller, if you can call them smaller. They are smaller, but having small nuclear plants around the place, that really doesn't sound like the right solution to the problem.
Thank you. That a little bit more disagreement. and there. And possibly more from the next question as well. So onshore wind and solar have already been shown to be amongst the cheapest sources of renewable electricity, but they still face some pretty stiff opposition, including from the government benches. So how can government turn this round to enable rollout of these technologies, particularly with a focus on the political feasibility of how they turn it around? And do you believe they should turn it around? So George, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, so I think, as I've probably said before, I'm not in favour of setting any particular targets around, we need X gigawatts of onshore solar or onshore wind. They all these technologies have pros and cons associated with them. They're all potential sources of zero carbon energy to meet demands. So I would favour. Well, I think the biggest thing that we could do is to introduce locational electricity pricing, which would much more accurately reward and give value to onshore renewables, which are close to areas where zero carbon electrons have a market and are needed and demanded, and it would certainly send stronger signals and give bigger rewards to onshore wind and solar, probably more close to market in the southern parts of the country. It would also mean that it would be less attractive to do it in places that are further away from demand and are just going to require quite a lot of investment in grid infrastructure, which, arguably under the current system, the investors may not be fully facing the costs associated with that. So I think locational electricity pricing would be key, not just in getting more onshore wind and solar and making it more valuable and worthwhile to try and address the constraints that would provide, a source of money for perhaps community projects to make them more make host communities more favourable to them. So I think that's the single biggest thing that I'd say in relation to this question.
Thank you. And there's something potentially controversial in that, because not everyone is pro locational pricing. So would Mark, you like to pick up on that one?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've got a strong bias here because our business is about putting power on essentially consumer user sites, industrial commercial sites. So, I'm generally not a big fan of taking over greenfield land and turning it into a solar farm, turning it into a wind farm. I don't have a particular objection to wind farms. Don't get me wrong; it's not about aesthetics for me. For me, it's about there's an awful lot of roof space. There's an awful lot of car parking space. There's an awful lot of brownfield locations or already developed built infrastructure locations where putting solar panels in, putting energy storage systems in, putting in systems for decarbonization of heat and transport. There's a lot of those things where you can take that existing land and make it work differently, which I think represents a much better way to spend. Stop, taking over the green land and use the stuff that's already there. And that comes with the double advantage then of not placing the challenge back onto the national infrastructure, national grid and the local DNOs, because you're generating energy where you're using that energy.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more valuable. If you go in behind a meter, every kilowatt hour you generate is a kilowatt hour you're not taking from the grid, and that's more valuable than feeding that kilowatt hour into the grid.
Yeah.
So without sounding too much a revolutionary, it's more like power to the people where, put power, generate the power where they're using that power. Don't move it across the grid. Avoid all those costs and those headaches that go with it. And it's interesting, I think George is right. There's a lot of merit in locational pricing, But arguably, when you're generating power on price, you're kind of creating that locational pricing. Every energy you generate is creating a local, cheaper energy resource. But the point of locational pricing is you then extend that to cover an area where we've got multiple off-takers and consumers, and that would enable things like those community projects to happen, where and actually you already see a little bit of this happening kind of at sometimes a local council or borough council level, where there's a kind of an area postcode where it's identified that some sort of combined solar scheme can be put together with some financial incentives there. So you kind of get a little bit of that locational pricing, but it's not managed in the way that I know George is advocating. There are countries which are doing that, but it just becomes really complex, really fast as to how you divide that up, and it is the way the energy market in the UK is structured makes it very hard to make that transition for us. So I think we've almost got it, but we're just doing it a different way, and I think that's probably the right way to do it.
So do you think that there is a policy tension not dissimilar to the one with nuclear, in terms of if policy pursues supporting onshore wind and solar on greenfield sites, that then that's sort of almost a detraction, or something physically goes into place that then makes it less viable to do that brownfield rooftop stuff?
I think it can be a distraction. Yeah, I mean a distraction. I wouldn't say it detracts. It's just a distraction. Focusing on these arbitrary targets, arbitrary numbers. It's not really the right answer. The better answer is to look at that individual business, or look at that individual site or that individual industry, and say, right, what can you do to get to zero carbon? Yeah, it's say you look after your pennies and the pounds look after themselves. You've got to start at that local level, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. If you try and do this at national level, what you end up doing is building a huge amount of infrastructure, and those projects have to be huge, and they have to be and they tend to be very hard to fund, because they're very long term, very, very long term, 20, 30, 40 years consideration. When you can get that down to 2 or 3 years consideration, as you can, or 5, or maybe at worst 10 years consideration in local energy storage and local generation on existing, building on existing infrastructure, not creating, long, way-leave arrangements to cover traversing cables across 15 different farmland. It becomes very much easier. Yeah. When you keep it local, and I think having the stability in the regulatory framework, in the incentives framework that enable people to make those decisions, I think is crucial, and that's I think where we're lacking a little bit at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. John.
Well, I mean, all I can say, it just seems a bit perverse to me if we sort of say all this net zero stuff's too expensive, and you then say you can't actually then do the cheapest forms of renewables. It just seems a wrong message to me. I mean, I take Mark's point. I think we should be using every opportunity to sort of get renewables in there, and I wouldn't sort of prioritise one over the other. I think they should, but effectively banning one, it just seems wrong to me. It does raise the point, though, and it's something we're looking at BEAMA now, is that there is not enough effort being put into understanding the consumer side of all of this and explaining it to them. We're talking about, huge changes in the way we deal with energy. The locational issues come up. Flexibility only works because we start either charging people more or charging them less because they use electricity in a certain location at a certain time. We're used to the sort of the universal price for things. That's a very different way to how it's done. And you'll immediately get sort of postcode luxury headlines in the press as soon as you start doing it. But if you want all these sort of flexibility markets to work, you've got to do that. But who's explaining that to the public and trying to make it clear to them that actually this is in their best interest and this is how they can benefit from it?
I think you make a very interesting point there, John. That the consumer perspective and the consumer voice is basically absent in the debate, certainly around locational pricing. I mean, I'm going to industry events quite regularly on it, and it's all about investors and their stability of their revenues and so on. And it's very much a debate that's dominated by the producer and investor voice. And it's difficult to get the consumer voice in there. I mean, it's interesting that Citizens Advice yesterday published a piece on locational pricing and what it might mean for consumers, which is quite a thoughtful piece, I think. But also, it sounds interesting listening to both Mark and you, John, that this. Potentially, if we change the way we do things, we can really unleash a lot of this local bottom-up projects, actions. It would really change the terms of trade, would really reshape the market and make, as you say, exploiting some of those sites, those car parks and so on that are close to centres of demand would make it much more valuable to be doing that rather than building renewables in places that are remote from demand and require lots of infrastructure. I mean, that's not to say we're going to need loads of renewables anyway, but it's just a question of getting the balance right and making sure we economise in the use of energy, and we take the opportunities to produce it on site close to centres of demand as well.
If I may chip in again, there's actually some good progress that we are seeing happening. So obviously we've most of us will have heard about the French policy to make sure that all big car parks are turned into solar car parks. Of course, it's great news for a country like mine if the UK was to follow suit. And that's a great sign of confidence in that kind of repurposing of land. And of course EV charging is another associated repurposing opportunity. Instead of a cost sink, you've now got a revenue generation opportunity in each car parking space, revenue from solar and revenue from EV charging potentially. So that becomes quite motivating from a business or landowner perspective. What's great is there's a consultation underway at the moment, or maybe just about finished, around whether, for example, solar car parks would be considered as permitted development, and that would take away one of the blockers, one of the inhibitors to progress in that area. The other kind of blocker, as we know, is this grid infrastructure. Local grid, local distribution infrastructure, and the national grid essentially balancing capacities, which are holding it back. And a lot of investment is needed in that area to enable these projects to progress at the local level. And I think that's the key. It's actually quite, the incentives are already there. For example, installing solar on your car park, because it's cheaper electricity. Putting it on your roof is cheaper electricity. It's quite a lot cheaper to generate electricity on your roof than it is to take it off the grid. And that's been the case for a long time. The challenges associated with making that happen are the things we need to take those blockers away. And the last point I'd make is actually there are much bigger problems out there that we need to look at. The long-term net zero strategy needs to look at the long-term storage challenge. We don't have enough space for enough pumped hydro. Batteries don't make sense for long-term storage. Are we going to put hydrogen in salt caverns, or have we got some better technologies? These are the big investment areas where there isn't currently a plan. And I think it was, as you, John, earlier talking about heating buildings, the decarbonisation of transport and electricity is a little bit of cherry picking. These are the easy solutions to achieve. It's happening very fast and very well because it's easy. It's a lot harder to decarbonise heat. Where's our plan for decarbonising heat?
Thank you. Just let that question hang because it's such an important one. I think we can just squeeze one last question in, which is, and we've touched on this already, but not heard so much about perhaps a sort of a focused solutions answer. So the UK has some of the least efficient homes in Europe. It's behind European countries when it comes to rollout of energy efficient technologies like heat pumps. What would you like to see from the UK to help the country achieve better energy efficiency? that one first.
I'll
earlier on the length of the duration of schemes, for example.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say is, we've kind of gone beyond this tipping point. Okay, we can't save carbon on our way to safety. We have to save carbon. We have to avoid creating a bigger problem. But the only way forward from here is to innovate the way to success. There is no we have lots of very viable and investable technologies right now to reduce carbon, but we need to do more. And I think something the government's doing relatively well with Innovate funding is investing in promising new technologies. I hope I think that a lot more of that would be important, enabling more funding into innovative solutions, I think is the only way that we can essentially get more bang per buck for the decarbonisation technologies we're deploying. But let's also not forget we have to invest in mitigating the impacts of climate change, which we know are coming. So I think it's slightly wrong to focus only on saving carbon. We're past that. We had that opportunity 40 years ago and we missed it. Now we've got to focus on innovating solutions to what we know is coming and ways to decarbonise.
Thanks, Mark. I think I may have made a mistake in my timing and I'm trying to let us run to 11. Jordan, is that right? Do we need to wrap up now?
If you can, it's absolutely fine. There was a break straight after, so.
Sorry. I thought we were running till 11. Okay, apologies to John and George for not giving you a chance to answer that one then. Thank you so much for all of those contributions. Just been taking some notes on sort of what I think the key themes have been, and I think the really interesting ones to pull out are, ambition does not equal delivery. Targets should really focus on outcomes, not specific numbers of widgets and technology focused. Local level needs both power and resources to be able to act in terms of authority and capacity. And the government should not just take away obstacles to delivery, but they need to look at what is actually working against delivery and deal with that, which can be harder. So I will wrap it up there. Thanks again to the panelists for their contributions and for the chat questions.